The incident from Autobiography of a Yogi, which is referred to in this reading, where Yogananda, as a young man, he's graduated from high school and has refused to go to college. And now that he's gotten his high school diploma, he feels justified in leaving his parents' home, his father's home. His mother has long since passed away. And even though his father wants him to take a more worldly path, Yogananda, is a young Indian man now in the early, just past the 1900s, says, I'm going off to live in this ashram. And he goes off from his home in Calcutta to the city of Varanasi, Benares. And he enters into this hermitage. But the hermitage life is not conducive to the level of dedication that Yogananda himself has long since embraced. So he's living this he's finally escaped from the authority of his father, but now he has this sort of institutional religious group, and he still determinedly goes into his meditation room and does his practices, even though the other ashramites don't endorse what he's doing. And then he has this morning in which this supernal voice comes and says, your master is coming today. Now, Yogananda himself was a self-realized guru before he was born. So the drama of his life is like a role on the stage that he took on. He plays it like a good actor would. If you're on the stage and you're playing a part, you can't always be thinking, this isn't me, this isn't really me, this can't be me. You have to commit yourself to the whole drama of the moment as if it were really happening. I remember before we had as many older children in our school, we had more adults in our children's plays because the children were just too young and the play wouldn't have had any substance. And because of that, when we did the life of Jesus, I was one of the people who got to play the Virgin Mary. And Gary was Joseph, and Matthew, our school teacher, played the part of Jesus. And he did a magnificent job. But I still vividly remember in my mind, there was the scene where Joseph had died. We had Joseph die in our little play because we needed to have some clarity of drama in there. And I was Mary, and I was, distraught because Joseph had died. And then Matthew was Jesus, and he sort of pulled me away. And it's interesting in my consciousness because I can still remember, and the way I decided to play it was I wouldn't pay any attention to Matthew pulling me away. I would just be the person who was distraught over my husband dying, and I would force him to take me off, which he did. And we all three of us entered into it so completely that I still feel in my heart the poignancy of Matthew's arms coming around me and him pulling me off that stage. It wasn't anything that was, quote, real, that we were living through, but the emotions that it represented and the tenderness of the human heart, that's completely independent of time and space, isn't it? Each of these little things that we play out, the details and the forms just come and go and come and go. But the deep feeling that all of this represents is something that happens on a soul level, that God himself experiences it with us. Swamiji talks about how tender-hearted Master was. It's a really interesting word, tender. Master was very tender-hearted because he was there with this awareness of what he had to give us in terms of liberating us from the necessity to suffer. And yet he would watch over and over again, even his dear disciples, be unable to rise, with the courage and the energy required to that eternal solution, and would just sink a little bit and take something a little bit less. And Swamiji talks of one time someone came into Master's room, Yogananda's room, and he was just weeping and weeping. What is wrong, Master? What have we done? And he just said, he named one of the disciples, Bill. He's going to leave the spiritual path. And Master was so tender-hearted, just thinking of him having to go off and have to go through all those hard experiences again when he'd come so close. if he just had the strength to go all the way forward. But we're all always caught in this dual reality of the apparent pleasure of the present moment versus the somewhat intangible promise of eternal freedom if we can just discipline ourselves on a day-to-day basis to make the right choices. In Yogananda's life, that story goes on, and he's in Varanasi, and as it tells an autobiography of a yogi, and he's just walking by this little alleyway, and he sees at the end of that alleyway his own guru, Sri Yukteswar, who was a very dignified man, elderly even already at that point, but with tremendous power. And as Yogananda describes it, Sri Yukteswar is just standing there like this. And Yogananda goes by and just gets a glimpse of that consciousness. And he's drawn to it, but he sort of moves by a little bit quickly. And then as he goes past, he feels the consciousness of Sri Yukteswar pulling him back. And he has packages in his hands, and he throws them into the hand of his companion. And then he turns and he rushes back. And he finds Sri Yukteswar just unmoving, just standing at the end of that alleyway. And Yogananda, as a young boy, comes and throws himself at his guru's feet because he immediately had never seen him in this lifetime, but he recognized the face as one he had seen often in vision. And then there's this extraordinarily tender reunion between them. Sri Yukteswar says, "My own, you have come to me." Now, this is the divine romance. This is what it is that we're talking about. And Swamiji puts that story in with this parable of Jesus, where we have these 10 virgins wandering around with their lamps, waiting for their bridegroom to come. And some of them are foolish and some of them are wise. It's never a story that I've liked very much. I don't know why. The picture of foolish virgins, I just, something about it just never attracts me. But the story of Yogananda meeting his guru has always moved me so deeply. Now, very rarely in our lives do we have a moment like Yogananda had meeting Sri Yukteswar. For many of us who are disciples of Yogananda, Yogananda was already outside of his body before we even came onto this path. But all of us have these moments when the Divine Spirit somehow or another manages to break through the thick walls of indifference that we carry around, and somehow the touch of that divine lover comes all the way in and moves us. Isn't that so? You know, and it's because of those moments, we string those moments together, and that really becomes the substance of our lives. You know, it's a very interesting fact to contemplate that so much of what we experience in this life doesn't really happen. It's the oddest thing. I was thinking once when, so often from our perspective, we think that God really doesn't have his act together very well, and that what's going on in this world is really quite a mess. And if I were in charge, I would do it differently. You know, nobody would starve, there would be no wars, people wouldn't suffer, there wouldn't be such disappointment. I mean, we have it all figured out. And sometimes we even reject the concept of God at all, because how could God be such a moron and still be God? It's just like the mind just doesn't work. But then when we meet people of elevated spiritual consciousness, and demonstrably elevated consciousness, because we feel it, they uplift us. All of them, and this is what the masters say, they all think it's a fair deal. They all think that God really knows what he's doing. Swamiji Kriyananda called this morning, and he was just talking about what a blissful state of consciousness he's in. He went, the last 5 days he spent in Medjugorje in Yugoslavia, which is where, like 28 years ago, the Virgin Mary started appearing there to a group of what were then children, 5 or 6 children. And she's been appearing every day, and then special occasions every month or so, to those people for 28 years. Now they're all grown up. Some of them have married and have families. And so this whole place for all these years has been permeated by the mother's consciousness. And he felt this inward inclination to go. He'd never visited there. So he took 2 people from Ananda Sangha. He said, he took his nurse and he took Nandini, who'd been to Medjugorje and could help them. He said, I don't want anyone else. I don't want an entourage, is how he put it. He often travels in a huge crowd. But he said he was very, very deeply moved by the whole experience. And he was able to meet 2 of the visionaries. Although Vika, the main one, he says she hasn't met with anybody for years. But somehow or another, she agreed to meet him. And there's a photograph of them, and their faces look exactly the same. You know, she's a woman maybe in her 30s, he's 83 and a man. They just look exactly the same because their eyes are in love with God. You can see that. And Swami was talking about just the blissful state he's in, and he said he went into the big dining room where their retreat meets, and he said he just looked around, and he said he looked at all the people and he thought, God manifests in so many different ways. Isn't it delightful? Isn't that a marvelous way to think of it? So many different ways. Isn't it delightful? Now, the reason why, once we reach this higher state of awareness, or even in the moments when we touch into it, that we don't complain anymore. We complain before we have that consciousness, when we don't understand, and once we come to a higher level, we don't complain anymore. Because you see, all of this that we define as suffering, it doesn't really exist. It's just this drama on the stage. And people suffer because they've gotten so into their roles that they don't remember that they were just sent out on the stage to play this part. You know, there we were. We had to do the whole experience of Jesus dying. You know, Matthew has to take poor Mary away from Joseph, and then later on in this play, we had a different altar up there at that time, but we had Jesus nailed on the cross. It was a little too dramatic. We had somebody hammering nails like this. It was terrible. And then they took Jesus off, and I was Mary, and I got to sit up there, and then they just laid Matthew out as Jesus, and I'm holding his head like this. I mean, we were in it. We were way, way in it, you know. It was like, it's terrible like this. But as soon as it was over, it had just been this extraordinarily tender, intensely beautiful experience of all the ways in which human beings can interact with each other. But the whole thing rolls out into perfect bliss. So where do we complain? What do we complain about? And to whom do we complain? Because God gave us these experiences that expanded our sense of compassion, that challenged us to be more courageous than we ever thought we could be, that showed us that we have a nobility of character, that all the heroes of all the epics of the world aspire to, and that show us also how far we can fall. You know, the story of the 10 virgins wandering around was not something that Krishna and Arjuna really were dealing with. Krishna and Arjuna lived long before Jesus and his parables were there. But Arjuna asked the question, and this is the last part of our reading today. Arjuna asked the question, and the longer passage in the Gita is, look, Krishna, Arjuna says. Arjuna is the disciple, Krishna is the Lord incarnate. Arjuna says, look, I'm going to give up all these things that I think are going to make me happy on this promise that I'm going to have this eternal bliss. But what if I make that enormous effort and I don't make it? What if I can't really rise to the level? What if along the way my heart falters and I quit and I just die without having succeeded? And Krishna's answer is one of the most famous lines in the Gita. Krishna says to Arjuna, he says, Arjuna, my devotee is never lost. And that's telling us that it doesn't really make any difference, you know, that we don't have to be perfect in this effort, we just have to sincerely try. Swamiji said this also in the initiation ceremony we were at a couple of weeks ago. He said, everything is directional. God doesn't care how many times you fail. He really doesn't. We take it so seriously, don't we? Oh, look at me, I've done something wrong. Swamiji once expressed that is, this is just a reverse form of egotism, you see? I've made a mistake. I have made a mistake. I have made a mistake. You know, this should be perfect one has made a mistake. You know, and we just get so excited about the self-evident fact that of course you made a mistake. Who did you think you were after all? But the error that we make is that then we identify ourselves with that. We define ourselves by it. And worse than that, we don't have the greatness of heart to imagine a God who isn't like us, whose love is truly unconditional, and watches us stumble around. It has nothing to do with the sincerity of our heart. It's just the mistake that we've made. We've identified ourselves so deeply with the play that we've forgotten our true nature. But that doesn't have anything to do with our relationship with God. And so Krishna is promising Arjuna, make a good effort, and if you don't succeed, don't worry about it, because every good energy that you've put out will stay with you. And then the rest of those verses in the Gita explains, and they're talking in terms of reincarnation. In one lifetime I haven't quite succeeded, and so I die and I have to take birth again. And then Krishna explains all the really good things that you're going to have when you're born the next time. You're going to have noble parents, you're going to have wealthy parents. The advantage of wealthy parents is you get to fulfill all your desires when you're young. You don't have to spend your whole life thinking you'd be happier if you were richer. You get to find out earlier that it doesn't make that much difference. You get noble parents, you get wealthy parents, you get harmonious parents. And if you're really, really lucky, but such births are hard to come by, Krishna says, you get born to yogis, to people who will really start you out in exactly the right direction. All of this is the fruit of failing spiritually, because at least you tried, you see? At least we tried. It says, as Swamiji often says, God doesn't mind our failures. The only thing he minds is our indifference, you see. If the spiritual path doesn't matter to us, then that's what makes God weep. Because then there's nothing he can do for us. In the life of Sri Yukteswar, Yogananda tells a story about this young boy named Kashi. And Yogananda just writes it like this. He said, who can fathom the attraction of the heart? Sri Yukteswar found in this young man, Kashi, an attractiveness that no one else saw. And so even though Sri Yukteswar was such a stern and seemingly impersonal soul, this young boy, he really tried hard to work to bring this boy forward. And Kashi, it all went to his head, and he became arrogant and many different things. And then Kashi announced to Sri Yukteswar that he was going to go visit his home village. And despite Sri Yukteswar's gentle hints, and it's interesting that we think of Sri Yukteswar as being very stern, but he can't interfere with a disciple's free will. Despite Sri Yukteswar's gentle hints that this was not a good idea, Kashi went anyway. And he stayed away for a few months, and when he returned, Yogananda writes, he'd fallen into bad habits. And he'd become the gross character that he always had the potential to be, that Sri Yukteswar was trying to save him from. And so Sri Yukteswar, with tears in his eyes, comes to Yogananda and says, he's no longer suitable for the ashram life. I can't bear to tell him. I can't bear to tell him to leave. He said, you'll have to tell him to leave. And then he says, the world will have to be his guru now. Meaning he's going to have to just go out and have to have his own experiences. And that's what we do. We go out and we try again and again. I know that perfect happiness will come to me through this means. And we devote ourselves to trying to have it. And we eventually, if we're determined enough, get it. And as Swamiji tells us, which is a very important point, we learn much more from being fulfilled than from being frustrated. If we don't get what we want, we keep imagining that we would be happy if we had it. And so sooner or later, we have to have it. Yogananda makes just a stunning statement when he says, everything that you no longer are attracted to is because you have already experienced it. And you've essentially drunk that cup to the bottom, and you know that is not going to give you satisfaction anymore. I mean, he's talking about anything, like being a murderer, being a thief, being a drug addict. We've tried it all. He says we have to try everything. We're so egoically directed. We won't take anybody's word for it. We have to try it all. And that's why they say by the time you're really serious about being on the spiritual path, there's a lot of history behind you. So we're not still seeking, thank God, terribly gross pleasures, except perhaps occasionally. But we still imagine, I love living in Palo Alto. I think it's really a marvelous place. I describe it to my friends as intelligent, cultured, educated, refined people, their last desperate effort to find satisfaction through the material plane. Everything in this area is just perfectly done. Like if it was ever going to really work, it'll work here, that's for sure. That's the truth. But 4 high school students threw themselves in front of a train over this last year, And I've been told the parents get together to talk about it. They don't have any idea why. They don't understand that life without God, and sometimes young people, and I mean the tragedy cannot be over-described. But these young people have been given everything, but they've almost deliberately been given no meaning. And in that intensity of youth, that over-dramatic, you just think, what's the point? Because without higher purpose, without the oil in the lamp, the form alone, we have the 10 virgins with the empty lamps and the 10 who are nurturing the oil. It's not just carrying around the lamp and having the name and looking like this and all these things. There has to be that the fuel for the inward flame. No one can give that to you. No one can give that to you. That's why when the 5 ask the others, give us yours, they say, well, there might not be enough for us. It's a strange answer. But the real answer is no one can give it to you. You can't say to someone, love God. All right, I will, You can tell them you'll go to hell if you won't, and then you can make them conform. That works. Guilt and fear, gets their attention. But it doesn't change the heart. No one can give that to you. That's why the Master himself weeps. No one can help you. But when it begins to penetrate our consciousness, that there is an inward reality, and that inward reality is the source of everything I seek. That's the bridegroom. That's the image of the Master. That's the burning oil. That's the reason that I live. These virgins tend their lamps because the bridegroom is coming. We give it something the human mind can grasp. Perfect love, perfect union, perfect attunement. Isn't that what we long for? And we seek it here and we seek it there. But the kingdom of heaven, as Jesus says, is within. You don't find it low here and low there. The kingdom of God is within. And if even the tiniest spark of that burns in your heart, nourish it, nurture it with everything you have. No, this is the Christmas season. This is when Christ is born. And we act it out with the baby. But what we're really trying to do is to act it out within our own souls. Join in with that and seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all that we seek will become ours as well.